Right, so this is something that I've been waiting for. I'm quite excited to get testing. This is GEEKOM's new A9 2026 edition, and it's the Max version, which means this features some of the best APU performance from AMD in a really competent package. So I believe this comes with the 890M GPU, and also a really competent processor with plenty of power, genuinely, probably more powerful than anything else I own, but let's get this open. So already on the underside of the box we can see A9 Max, and it's got the Ryzen 9 AI HX 470, which is certainly a bit of a mouthful. You also have 32GB of DDR5. That's right, you get DDR5, probably one of the easiest ways to get a hold of it, and a 2TB M2 SSD, which is also surprisingly difficult to get a hold of, but these aren't. So there we go. Always their packaging is absolutely wonderful. Right, so what do we get inside? It's a big lad. For a mini PC, I mean, I say that, it's still about the size of my hand. I'd imagine to fit all that power in. It does need a larger surface area, probably for cooling, because I think, off the top of my head, this APU's got about a 50-watt TDP, in and around that. Usually GEEKOM's cooling solutions are very good. I mean, most of the time we test them, we always see that it is best in class for the actual APU package they've put in. They usually do extract the most amount of power you can get out of it, and that's absolutely lovely. So what do we got? We've got 4 USB 3 ports, we've got audio out, got our power in, 2 HDMI ports, of course, for multi-monitor. We've got 2 USB-Cs, which is very convenient, to be fair. I use USB-C on mine. A lot of my editing is done on a similar style mini PC from GEEKOM, and I use the USB-C for output to the monitor, just because it's more convenient. You get 2 Ethernet ports for great networking, which makes sense because I'd imagine you could probably host local AI models if you really wanted. We'll have to give that a bit of a go. And of course, you cannot forget how convenient it is to have a real SD card reader. Our thank you letter. So of course, if there's any concerns, please do get in contact. I must say, I've never had any problems, but dealing with GEEKOM is always a wonderful experience. So we've got our HDMI cable, very nice. We do in fact have our UK power plug. Actually getting a UK plug, very nice for me. And we have our power brick. A BSY adapter capable of outputting up to 120 watts under peak load. And I'd imagine that APU package in here probably can spike up to that. We will do some full power testing, but I'd imagine that is just to deal with boost loads from a Ryzen processor. And last but not least, we do have a VESA mount kit, which is very convenient for these, so you can have them on the back of your monitor if you really want. But of course, we need to get this plugged in, we need to get it set up, and we need to get it all ready to go. Now, I'd imagine with the power on display here, we probably will move to my 4K setup over here. It is a little bit of a mess, but you can see down there, that's what I edit on. I edit on a GEEKOM PC, but I use a big 4K setup, so we probably will need to move over here at some point to do a bit of 4K testing, I'd imagine. But as always, setting these up is one of the simplest things in the world. Just need HDMI cable and our power. So ease of use points, it's about the same as always for GEEKOM. It is that simple, and we are now ready to turn it on, which for me is great because I'm not cleaning out dirt. I couldn't even tell it had turned on there. There's no fan noise whatsoever. And a point of interest for a lot of people is, can you do an offline Windows 11 setup out of the box? We're not going to connect it up to the internet. We are just going to see if we can go over to Windows 11 and we can just simply use the PC without needing to add any online credentials. Yes we can. So we'll let Windows set up. I'd imagine with the power in this thing, it shouldn't take long, but you can do an offline setup, which I know is very important for a lot of people. Possibly the quickest Windows 11 setup I've ever personally seen, but let's just run DXDiag and take a quick look at the specs. So there we have it, GEEKOM A9 Max with the AMD Ryzen AI HX 470 with the Radeon 890M. And you do get your 32 gigs of DDR5. We got the NVMe storage, which is a Kingston unit, so it is reputable brands for this. We have the NPU. To be fair, I've dabbled around with NPU testing. I'm sure we will do some because I do use it for Audacity, using OpenVINO. It's very convenient, and to be fair, with certain tasks, actually does help speed up the processing. But as always, one of people's favorite parts of these tests is, can we make it slow down? So we are going to have to go with not just one drive with installs, we're going to have to bust out the other one as well. Of course, we've got to have Crysis, so Crysis has got to go on here. The installers are finishing before I can start more of them. Get more installers running. We need more. We need as many as possible, but I'm trying to beat the system. It's too quick. Halo, yeah, install Halo. Crysis is installing, that's installing, SimCity's installing. Right, what else? What if we get some programs? Okay, Halo's already done. Oh, right, this is ridiculous. Right, I don't think we're going to be able to make this slow down, but we're going to try and install as much as possible. Get these all installing. I can't move quick enough to get multiple installers going at once. And it's not struggling at all. Right, let's try and get a couple more on here. What does that leave us? QuickTime? Yep, we need QuickTime on here. That's very important. Right, we're trying to do the can we make it slow down test. It doesn't slow down. That is the big takeaway here. There is not a single degree of this slowing down with day-to-day tasks. So if you're buying this for day-to-day, probably the quickest thing you'll ever use. That's everything. So our uptime is about 10 minutes, and within 10 minutes we have already got it set up and ready for testing with video editors, Steam, all my monitoring software, multiple games, and it didn't slow down once. The limit was how fast I could click things, so quite impressive. To try and place it against hardware we're used to, I'm going to run Time Spy, just because I've got to know how it's going to perform. So I'm going to let this run through, and we're going to find out exactly what score we get. And it's looking solid. A good way of understanding this is this green line is us, this blue line is dual channel, and this line here is single channel setups. So as we can see here, in terms of a single channel device, really, really good. But still not enough to match a dual channel setup. Now, of course, that will be very much game dependent and memory bandwidth dependent. But of course, the real test real quick will be trying to run a game on it. So I'm going to pick something relatively intensive to see if this tiny little mini PC can handle some relatively modern gaming. But how does it deal with its own default settings? And it's running between 35 to 60 FPS. And this is actual gameplay as well. This isn't just the benchmark. You can't run the benchmark in this game to conclude performance. But this looks very, very nice. Okay, so we've got FSR on balanced, and the rest of the game set to medium and high in 1080p. I mean, that's really not bad performance there, getting 30 to 40 FPS with those settings. So my plans for testing today is to run this through the full benchmark suite. I want to run as many processor-bound tasks as I can on it. I'm going to get on with the rest of the testing, and it looks like we're in for a pretty good time. But what are the full specifications of the GEEKOM A9 MAX? Well, processor-wise, you have a Ryzen AI HX 470, and as someone that's already been through and done all the benchmarking, this is an exceptionally impressive processor tucked into a very reasonable power envelope, featuring 12 cores and 24 threads at 2 to 5.2 GHz at full boost, at least from my own readings. It was slightly over 5.2, around 5.25. You also get the legendary AMD 890M iGPU here, and 32 GB of DDR5. That's right, somehow they have still managed to get a hold of DDR5, albeit you do have room for expandability as this is running in single channel, so you have a slot open should you want to push it further. This has also got 2 TB of NVMe storage, which is also upgradable, and runs Windows 11. So the entire system is upgradable and expandable, as it tends to be with GEEKOM, and they've gone with a really reasonable setup here if you are looking at using this as an all-purpose PC. So especially Workstation, LLM, and AI tasks, you've got an NPU on here and all this, and you've also got a competent graphics card on board as well. From what I've seen, prices seem to be starting from $11.95, but I'm sure they'll send me some discount codes to put down in the description in case you are interested. But with a device with this much power, the one thing I want to get out of the way first is all the synthetic testing to see how this thing compares in synthetic tests. And if we start this with a progression throughout all of the 3D Mark tests, we can see exceptionally solid DirectX 10 performance. Now on the CPU side, this might seem a little bit low, but you gotta remember this is only really stressing 1 core, maybe 2, so it is really brutal on single core performance, and even then, it is doing reasonably well. Skydive, of course, moving into the world of DirectX 11, and we see an overall score of 19,000. Firestrike goes on to show that the processor score, as more cores are utilized, becomes just a powerhouse, and even GPU performance is still looking reasonably solid. Moving into the DirectX 12 era, we see a very good score across the range with DirectX 12's Night Raid benchmark, but moving into the more relevant and more modern tests with Time Spy, we see pretty decent iGPU performance, especially given this is running a single channel setup, but exceptionally good processor performance performance. The last 3 tests are of course all GPU bound, and we see a respectable score of 2204 in Steel Nomad Lite, a score of 420 in the full-fat Steel Nomad, so even on single-channel memory bandwidth we are actually getting a pass here, and even ray tracing returned as 282 in the form of Speedway. Now if we take a look at the individual parts, first of all with the graphics card, we can see that in TimeSpy it places itself between an RX 460 running an overclock and slightly behind the Radeon 780M and the likes of the 1060 and RX 580. Because we are running single channel memory bandwidth here, I was impressed to actually see it beat entry-level Polaris cards and even a 750 Ti, given that we are running single channel DDR5, so there is a good degree of graphics performance here, and that's taking into account the architecture does deal with DirectX 12 reasonably well. When we move on to the world of Firestrike, which is an older DirectX 11 based task, we can see it now finds itself between a 750 Ti and the RX 460, which is likely due to the architecture and the memory bandwidth required in certain DirectX 11 titles. Moving on to the processor though, and this really is one of the standout parts, the Ryzen AI HX 470 in a TimeSpy physics test which doesn't really fully utilise the full power of this processor, even then pretty much goes on to match my Ryzen 7 3700X, which is the processor we normally benchmark everything with, and has yet to ever be bottlenecked in any instance we've tried. So it goes on to destroy every other processor we've tested on the graph, because none of them can compete with this tiny APU. That's right, taking second spot on the leaderboard behind my actual desktop. Now if we move on to 3D Mark's CPU profile, which gives us a nice breakdown of individual core performance, we can see that the max threaded performance of the entire device, including boosting, is 9784. Before this though, we get a nice linear curve from 1 threads up to 16 threads, which goes on to show that you do get really reasonable performance out of this. If we try and throw some extra processors in for comparison, I am still collecting data for CPU profile, so these will become more and more fleshed out as we carry on, as it's a reasonably new benchmark, and as we can see, the performance here is absolutely insane. When compared against a first-gen Ryzen desktop, a Haswell Core i7 equivalent, and an old AMD A8 that I've got the data for, we can see that it absolutely destroys all of them. Single-threaded performance is around double that of a Haswell i7 on its own, and when you bring that up to 4 threads, well, even then, it is still around double. So to summarise that sort of synthetic testing performance, what we're seeing is the iGPU is affected by the single-channel memory. This does make sense. Ideally, with an iGPU, you do want to be running dual channel, but they have left room for expandability, so there is extra performance available for you should you want to upgrade in the future, which I can sort of understand with the RAM situation right now. At least you managed to get your foot in the door, so in the future you can push it further. In terms of the processor side performance, even in this configuration where it's hardly using any power at all, I've got full power consumption testing later on in the video, we see incredibly solid performance that is up there with the Ryzen 7 3700X in my main PC. And this is in a tiny APU in a very small computer. Now, as much as this configuration does offer you the expandability to push it further, what I'm interested in is the performance you get out of the box, because when you hear people talk about the 890M, it usually is in a dual channel configuration. And as much as this device does seem like it's really sort of as a combination of a gaming machine and also a very competent workstation and AI hosting machine, it is interesting to take a look at the gaming performance, because how does a modern iGPU actually perform when it's running with just one stick of RAM in a single channel configuration? And I've gone through and I've done the entire benchmark suite, and it is an interesting one to benchmark because there are instances where we are clearly memory limited. However, it really is title dependent. In some titles where I wasn't even expecting to get playable frame rates, we were seeing them run absolutely fine, and it is purely around working around those memory limitations. So the question today is, if you take this device with the 890M and you're looking at doing a little bit of gaming with it, and you're not too fussed about upgrading to a dual channel configuration, what kind of performance will you actually get out of it? Now, we've already seen that it is really rather competent in the few tests that we've already done synthetically and at the start of the video, but how does it handle itself when we throw it up into the benchmarks? Starting things off, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which we are running with a mixture of high and very high settings in 1080p with HBIO enabled. This returned us 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 32 FPS, which honestly, very stable 30 FPS experience. You could drop it down to 720p to get around that 60 FPS mark if you wish to do so, but really it's your choice depending on how you want to run the game. If we move over into the world of GTA Online Enhanced Edition, we saw that our average went up by 1 frame per second, and our 1% lows went down by 1 frame per second, so at the end of the day it was a very similar experience overall and is within margin of error. So GTA Online, whether you're playing single player or online, it works absolutely fine with the Enhanced Edition, likely because this system does deal with DirectX 12 reasonably well. I mean, that's what the graphics card in this was always designed to deal with, modern APIs, and gives us a good place to place the system's performance, at least in DirectX 12 from the get-go. Moving back to the still very popular Legacy version, and we saw our frame rate actually go up. The reason for this is because, well, it needs less memory bandwidth, and because we're not needing as much memory bandwidth, it really does let the iGPU actually shine through with some increased performance. Running with very high settings plus AMD CHS shadows in a 1080p resolution returned us 51 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 41 FPS. So I could imagine if you had dual channel already, well, there's plenty of performance you can upgrade this system to, because, I mean, look, in a less memory-bound title, we're seeing a higher frame rate when usually we see it go down on these modern cards. Moving into the world of GTA Online Legacy, and once again we had a few utilization problems, but this is not a fault with the machine, this is purely how the Legacy version of GTA Online works when you're over a lobby of 16 players. We were in a packed out one, and we still returned 43 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 36 FPS, which overall is a fairly reasonable showing. Now, Counter-Strike 2 is a very interesting one for the system, because we are limited on memory bandwidth, but we also have a processor that is capable of churning out hundreds of frames per second here. I mean, even a synthetic test that showed it was similar to my 3700X, I know you can see in excess of 200 to 300 plus frames per second with no problems, especially in some of these simpler maps and scenarios. Running through with competitive settings in 1080p through the built-in benchmark, we returned 128 FPS on average, with really solid frame times down to just 94 FPS. However, if you moved over to the competitive 4x3 resolution of 1:80x960, it's very popular and people love seeing it tested, we saw that, well, our frame rate didn't really change that much. We went up to 148 FPS on average, and 1% lows remained pretty much unaffected, now around 99 frames per second. So it was slightly smoother, but honestly, 1080p or the smaller 4x3 resolution, it didn't really matter on the system. If we move into some of the more intensive maps, like the latest release of Cache, which as we all know is one of the most intensive maps there are out there yet, and we saw that we were still able to return 128 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 87 FPS. So when it comes to Counter-Strike 2, you're looking at over 100 frames per second, and it doesn't matter what map, situation, or scenario you're in, you'll probably be getting in or around this mark. One of my favourite Unreal Engine 5 titles to test is Arc Raiders, and it is fantastically optimised. However, we ended up with a weird imbalance here, where both the processor and the graphics card wanted to do more, and were fighting for the limited TDP and bandwidth available. So to resolve this, I just capped it at 30 frames per second, which immediately resolved all problems. Now, if you went for a lower range of settings or resolutions, you could get away with 60 FPS, but once again, you are limited on memory bandwidth, so you'd probably be looking at 720p with the same degree of settings to get closer to that 60 FPS mark. But with normal and high settings in 1080p with FSR set to balance mode, it was a flawless experience. Genuinely, our 30 FPS average was accompanied by 30 FPS 1% lows. The game pretty much didn't drop a single frame whatsoever, and if you're keeping an eye on the metrics in the top left, you'll notice that we have enough headroom left over that if the CPU needs to boost up for something, or the graphics card needs to boost up for something, they're not fighting over the bandwidth or the TDP of the system. So capping frame rates here really does help out. If you want a brutal situation for this setup to deal with, it has to be BeamNG on the jungle map. And it didn't matter what I did, unfortunately we couldn't get traffic running properly. Well, you could with lower settings and lower resolutions than this, but I didn't think that was really a fair showing. You could also just run simpler maps and it'd be fine. But still, with normal and high settings and no traffic and a 900p resolution, we did return 30 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 26 FPS. And the reason for this is purely because, well, we don't have enough bandwidth available in a single channel setup to be able to deal with this game and all of the traffic running in one of these situations
situations where the graphics card is also dealing with a ton of draw calls in a DirectX 11 engine. So yeah, it's not exactly fair on the system to be putting it through this in a single channel configuration, but it was still able to do it as long as you didn't have traffic enabled. So I'll give it credit for managing that, but BeamNG is really rather brutal here. We have already seen a little bit of Cyberpunk 2077 earlier, but the most playable way to play it on the system, and this did surprise me and impress me given we're running a single channel configuration, we were able to manage 1080p with medium and high settings and FSR set to the balance mode. Alternatively, if you're not interested in FSR, you could drop it down to just north of 720p if you really wanted to, somewhere between 720p and 900p, and you could return this 30 FPS experience. But given that FSR in this game is a rather nice implementation, I thought, you know what, we'll keep it enabled. And we returned a locked 30 FPS. Genuinely, I thought there'd be some sort of way for me to get this to struggle on the system, but no. Cyberpunk 2077 genuinely runs absolutely fine on a single channel setup with these frankly great looking settings, which I really wasn't expecting. I was expecting that once the boosting was over and the system calmed down a little bit, we'd get stutters or frame rate problems, especially with loads of NPCs and big battles going on. But no, we didn't drop a single frame per second, so Cyberpunk 2077 looks and runs pretty much great. Given this is new hardware though, I do have to put it through the worst that Unreal Engine 5 has to offer, at least the worst that is actually a popular title that people are playing. With Oblivion Remastered, we were able to manage normal settings plus low textures in a 720p resolution, and this is because this game is constantly just hogging as much VRAM as possible and is just brutal on memory bandwidth. We've seen on cards that utilize DDR4 memory, it's very unlikely you'll be able to even get it playing above 360p. But here on the little 890M, we were at least able to manage a high definition resolution and a capped 30 FPS frame rate. There were the occasional drops down from this when there was lots of combat going on, but generally it ran pretty okay with a locked 30 FPS, so I'm going to call this a win for the system given I wasn't actually expecting it to be playable given the setup we're using, but it has enough power that even though it's lacking bandwidth, it can brute force its way through this. I will say though the processor wasn't struggling whatsoever at all. PUBG is a bit of an interesting one because it is still lacking optimizations in certain areas. You can do what you can to try and get around the limitations, but there's a reason why I bought an R9 Fury for this back in the day. It just wants memory bandwidth, so it's another brutal test for a system that is running single channel memory. Now with the supposed competitive settings that people are running in DirectX 12 with a 900p resolution, we returned 55 FPS on average, with 1% lows that weren't particularly fantastic down to 31 FPS. But fortunately, and this seems really counterintuitive given how good DirectX 12 actually works on AMD GPUs in this game, I dropped it back down to DirectX 11.1, which saw our average increase to 56 FPS, our 1% lows also went up to 42 FPS, and we were able to increase our resolution from 900p up to 1080p. And the only reason for this, DirectX 11.1 in this game simply wants less memory bandwidth than DirectX 12 does. So given that you'd usually see the opposite happen, well, when you're memory starved, you can actually use DirectX 11 on an AMD GPU and it'll be better. Bit of an odd one, but it was playable. Now, this one I included because I was using Samson to try and monitor some boost levels for later on testing in the video, given it has some heavy shader compilation before the game launches up. It is a complete broken mess of optimization because I've actually played through the entire game now, and I have no clue if anyone's actually played this game at a locked 60 FPS. I personally played it at a locked 30 FPS on an RTX 3070. That's right, I was using an RTX graphics card and couldn't get above 30 FPS, so I thought, you know, I'm going to try it anyway and see if it can manage it, and with performance settings and FSR enabled, and it wasn't really playable. Now you've got to keep in mind that I don't think there's been a single thing we've tested yet on this channel that has actually achieved a playable frame rate in this game. It is genuinely downright brutal. It's quite fun, it's quite cheap, and I respect what they were trying to do with it because it can look quite nice in certain areas, but optimization-wise, even the processor is struggling while the game is doing absolutely nothing. Samson is, yeah, it doesn't run great. But still, it was an admirable showing with 27 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 20 FPS. It was controllable, but whether or not you'd want to go through that much suffering to play this game like that, I don't think there's even a point. So this was just a brutal test for no reason, but I thought, you know what, we might as well try. Despite us actually having enough VRAM assigned to the iGPU to actually be able to configure settings in Red Dead Redemption 2, I went with the options that it was running out of the box, which was bang in the middle, set to balanced, with a good mixture of low, medium, high and ultra. And the reason I went for these settings is because it runs at a locked 30 FPS. And that's about what I expected here. I mean, it gave enough headroom on the processor and the graphics card. Once again, they weren't fighting over the TDP. You could drop this down further if you were targeting 60 FPS, but given our limited bandwidth and single channel, a nice looking 30 FPS experience seemed good enough to me. M&B Bannerlord, I went with the default settings it recommended, which seemed to be predominantly high settings, but with the texture streaming size set down to medium. And that's likely because I have no clue how they've optimized this game so well. It probably detected the memory bandwidth available and decided to drop that option down to medium. It seems to make no difference to how the game's visuals actually present themselves, but given we're running a single channel setup, what it does do is just put less load on the memory bandwidth required. We were running a 60 FPS cap in place just in case it wanted to go over that figure, and for a lot of the early to mid game it could actually go over this. But for most of the actual late game battles, which is benchmarks reminiscent of, we returned 48 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 40 FPS. I think the lowest figure we saw throughout this entire benchmark was 38 or 37 FPS, so M&B Bannerlord worked perfectly fine. In a similar vein to Bannerlord, Hitman is also a particularly well optimized title that knows exactly what settings to run out of the box, and it defaulted to medium and high, predominantly high settings with textures down to medium, so it probably knows there's a memory bandwidth limitation given our single channel setup that we're running today, and we returned 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 30 FPS through the newer Dartmoor benchmark map. So in these well-optimized DirectX 12 titles like Hitman, it doesn't seem to be too much of a limitation because we're getting decent visuals, we're getting a solid frame rate, and honestly, if you were looking at playing this, well, you could just leave the computer on the desk, plug in a controller or whatever, play it mouse and keyboard if you really wanted, cap it at 30 FPS and you'll be fine. Once again, if you wanted a higher frame rate, you could also just drop the resolution, and that does in fact work here. A good test of both the CPU side performance, especially the single core performance, given that City Skylines 1 and 2 are very single core bound, and also the graphics side performance because optimizations in City Skylines are certainly lacking in certain areas. The game defaulted to high in 1080p, and we were running the FPS boost mod because, once again, if you aren't running that mod, this game is downright unplayable on virtually all systems. And with high settings, well, like I've already just said, we returned 37 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 FPS. It could take a little while for the frame rate to stabilize, and when lots of simulations were going on and there was a bit of a fight over the processor boosting power and the graphics card availability, it could stutter a little bit, but then again, this is City Skylines, it sort of does that when you're dealing with bigger cities. Overall though, I got a bit carried away, and given this is one of those systems where it speeds up with no problems whatsoever, I probably end up about 15 minutes of gameplay footage of this, which I've probably placed in, sped up to show you how the city's progressing, but for when it comes to those city builder titles, well, you've got more than enough CPU side performance, you're just going to have to monitor yourself in and around that GPU side as well. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Now, I was desperate to get some settings turned up to high here, because this game runs very well on low and medium settings and does look downright fantastic, but I wanted to know, can this configuration of the 890M, with how GEEKOM set it up, because they have set it up very well for a single channel device, can it handle higher settings here? So with a combination of medium and high settings in 1080p with a 30 FPS cap in place, could it eke out a playable frame rate? And it took a little bit of configuring around to see what settings we could actually handle, but we did in fact manage our 30 FPS target with an average of 30 FPS and 1% lows down to 26 FPS. The memory side limitations were very apparent with certain settings, and of course were very apparent when trying to increase anything going on post-processing wise. We were able to handle TAA, but nothing more than that. There was no SMAA or anything like that happening. So Crysis Remastered, it did surprise me here, but even on the single channel configuration they're using out of the box, they've set it up well enough that it can actually manage it with medium-high settings in 1080p. So overall performance, well, given we are dealing with single channel limitations, which definitely do hamper GPU side performance more than they hamper anything to do with the CPU side, because honestly, even in those intensive titles like Samson, it was still getting by absolutely fine and had plenty more room to give. Honestly, I can't see there being any title out there today, at least in terms of gaming, that is actually going to make that Ryzen processor in this begin to struggle. The processor's performance is genuinely phenomenal. However, I will give the system a degree of credit. Given it is a single channel limitation and there is room for expandability, it does mean that if you wanted to upgrade the RAM in this system, then you could actually get better performance than this. So, as an entry level into the world of gaming, it actually performs fairly in line with the synthetic testing we've done, but is also helped out by the fact that when you're not memory bound, for example GTA 5 Legacy or older titles, you get some really solid performance that the synthetic testing wouldn't have you believe. And that's the thing, is when you've got a single channel limitation, it is very much title dependent. Because for a lot of games like Arc Raiders, provided you don't mind 30 FPS, then higher settings really isn't a problem. Cyberpunk was one of the biggest takeaways from this, where I thought we are going to see some serious problems as the boost clocks come down and then you're going to run into a bit of stuttering. But no, I could not get this thing to drop a single frame. So out of the box, it does offer some really rather competent gaming performance that of course you could upgrade in the future, because you wouldn't just be adding extra RAM to the system, you're giving the iGPU more bandwidth. But given that gaming isn't the full focus of this device, it is also intended to be a really competent workstation, because let's be honest, we've seen it do some gaming, we've seen general usage out of the box, and if you're doing things like that, then it'll do it, and if it's general usage, it's not going to slow down. So how does it handle some more workstation-focused tasks? Even just initially looking at the device out of the box, you can see that this has got some very good networking capabilities. So ideally, in a home lab environment, you do have that Ryzen AI HX 470 chip. And it does deal with AI-based workloads incredibly well. I mean, it's in the name and it's no surprise, but GEEKOM have done a very good job accommodating to the chip that is actually at the core of this device. So I decided to do some local AI model hosting, which isn't something I usually delve into, and is something I've had to research quite a bit to actually test on this device, because, well, frankly, none of the tests I actually would perform can actually make it struggle. It doesn't slow down at all. So the way that I've actually managed to put some load onto things is, given we do have 32GB of RAM, I've assigned 8 gigs to the iGPU, and I've now decided to set up a Google Gemini instance, which was Gemma 4 E4B, which, as I'm led to believe, is one of the more intensive options out there, and I've seen on a few demos of it, it does bring your standard commercial desktop PC that you'd expect to find in someone's house down to their knees. And I was able to get away with a bit of testing. I've ran a few benchmark datas and I've got hold of a few bits. I don't have anything on hand to compare this to at the moment, but in general we would get a response anywhere from 45 to 55 seconds, or around 1 minute 16 seconds if we were actually performing data analysis. So for example, I gave the model that in this case I named Gordbot, which is based after a good friend of mine, Gordon, so we gave it a few of his personality quirks, and then we had it estimate a few things, we had it deal with a few Excel documents, and we also had it write a song, which it decided would be about big trucks in classic Gordon fashion. And generally, it wasn't too slow. I mean, waiting for a response for 45 seconds on a minuscule PC like this, just out of the box, isn't terrible LLM performance. Now, I don't doubt with more lightweight models, or if you were someone that actually went to the degree of optimizing for this, then you'd be able to get even more performance out of it. But you've got to remember, I'm still relatively new to this. It's something I will dabble with more in the future, especially in CPU side testing, because I feel that'd be quite interesting. But what you really need to know is, when running LLM instances, especially some of the more heavier ones out there, you are looking at a response time anywhere from 30 seconds through to a minute and a half for full data analysis. And to be fair, full data analysis done in a minute and a half isn't actually terrible. I mean, I was just having it review some breakfast school ratings, because we go out for breakfast and apparently we now vote on that and have done for the last 2 years, and there's now a giant Excel file of multiple CAFs and their scores. And getting that analysed is something it was more than happy to do. You do also have an NPU built into the device, which is something I have got more degree of testing with because I use one virtually every day, mostly in the form of OpenVINO, which you can get through Audacity, and essentially you can just run a deep net noise suppression. So rather than having to manually capture all of the noise around you, you can simply run it through DeepNet 3, and then you can get a level of noise that you're comfortable with in the background, which is a very convenient task, and I know a lot of people are now doing that within Audacity to make the audio sound cleaner, because It works really well compared to the older methods. And I will give the NPU credit here. It is a little bit funny to set it up in OpenVINO, but it did handedly beat the second most powerful PC I have on hand with a Core i9 185H, which is actually a GEEKOM mini PC I'm sat here using right now to edit this video, and it beat that quite handily by 10 seconds, which was taking a full hour and 25 WAV file, and then converting all of the noise in that, and then bringing it down to acceptable levels. So honestly, not a terrible time. I mean, both scored just over 2 minutes, which is about what you'd expect for NPU side performance, but the Ryzen AI's version of the NPU does beat out Intel's in software that Intel is sponsoring. So I will give them credit here. That aspect also does work incredibly well. So for audio processing or audio work, if you're someone that's going to be taking advantage of the NPU for processing or effects, then you could also get away with one of these because it was also silent while doing this. I won't delve too much into this because usually our workstation tasks would just be how does it handle editing, and one of the best editing tests I've come up with is Serif Movie Plus X6 because it is a brutal old school editing machine that I use myself that uses nothing but CPU side performance. And of course that is very outdated, but in terms of actually being a workstation benchmark that measures purely CPU speed, it is quite convenient to see how it does. But the problem is, with the Ryzen AI chip that the GEEKOM A9 is using, you don't really have to worry about it ever struggling. I was dealing with multiple 4K files in a timeline from a video on the Ryzen 3 1200 we made a few weeks ago, and it was blisteringly fast with no slowdown. It could handle 50 frames per second during the 50 frames per second segments, and 25 frames per second during the standard camera shot parts. So when it comes to editing, this thing absolutely destroys any task you throw up in front of it. Multiple 4K files, not a problem. I could spend ages talking about this and going through the semantics of it, but really all you need to know is that if you are performing any workstation task that isn't quite difficult LLM hosting, then it's not going to run into any problems. The whole reason for the main LLM segment is because my tasks like this that we would usually run through and do are simply too easy for it. So I've had to tell the guys there, I've just said, look, I've had to add a new segment into the video because everything else I do just simply doesn't stress it. I mean, this has great single core boosting, so it deals with the single-threaded nature of certain effects in Serif with no problems, and the multi-core performance means that it will render an hour-and-a-half video in full 4K in around 25 minutes on the processor alone. So that's really all I need to say. When it comes to build quality, thermals, and the actual power consumption of the device, in standard GEEKOM fashion, and I will give them credit for this because every device I have tested from them, when I run it through all the synthetic testing and my own benchmarking suite, they usually have the best configuration possible. And we have already seen it in the 3D Mark tests earlier, where this is destroying other single-channel based chips that are utilizing that Ryzen AI and the 890M graphics card. So they've set it up really well for a single-channel configuration, it just needs dual-channel to push it that little bit further. But the build quality is all there, the wireless adapters they use in these, I will give them credit for the wireless adapters because there's a signal that I usually get in my office that is about 1 bar on most wireless adapters I own. In fact, I've actually bought big ones with antennas just to be able to make it 3 or 4 bars. You get virtually full bars on this, just out of the box. They're wireless adapters, hands down, no problems. And to be fair, reliability-wise, I've also never had a single problem with a GEEKOM device. Whether it be their laptops, whether it be the mini PCs, my brother, who is... He's not very great with computers. He has killed most computers he's ever owned, even ones that I've built for him. His GEEKOM mini PC is still going. But anyway, that's all anecdotal, time for the real evidence. In terms of thermal performance, in terms of how hot this thing gets, the highest temperature I was able to record was 77 degrees under a peak burst load. So that's an initial burst load before the TDP is brought down by the chip and the boosting is over. In terms of gaming, you're looking around the mid-50s. In terms of media work and server hosting, you're looking around the mid-40s. Light usage just north of 40, and idle around the mid-30s. The reason for this, we have a heat wave here at the moment, and it is about 30 degrees outside, so of course, even at idle, it is going to run a tad warmer than that. And of course, these figures are directly correlated to power consumption. When you're talking about general usage and actually just using this thing as a computer, under 20 watts. It hardly has to lift a finger to do anything general usage. In fact, during our actual stress test of installing absolutely everything, it averaged out around 23 watts. That was with all of those programs installing, all the unzipping going on, and actually getting Steam running, 23 watts. It is not a power-hungry device. Gaming average places it just under 40, a full load stress test brings it up to 51 on both the CPU and GPU being stressed at the same time, and our peak burst load put it just under 70 watts, which is what I predicted earlier when I saw the power supply they provided with the PC. So in terms of thermals and power consumption and build quality and extra features, well, I personally can vouch for them because I've been using their stuff for a little while now, and it helps out the channel to be actually able to edit videos this well and have as much power on tap as I now have available. And I've never ran into any problems, and I cannot see this one running into any problems whatsoever. Genuinely, I was really surprised how power efficient and thermally efficient they've made it, given that it is still a device that will fit in your hand. So there we have it, the GEEKOM A9 MAX powered by the AMD Ryzen 9 AI HX 470, which is still quite a mouthful of a name for a processor. And to be fair, they have done a really good job setting this up, while also allowing expandability in the future, because by upgrading the RAM in this, you're not only giving yourself higher RAM capacity, but you can treat the performance you've seen today as a baseline that you can improve away from, because at least you've got 32 gigs in single channel running at the moment, which as we've seen is more than enough power apparently to get through a lot of modern gaming, at least a lot of games that I wasn't expecting. Cyberpunk at a locked 30 FPS, even running in single channel, is just not something I thought my takeaway from today's video would be. But also as a full workstation. I mean, I can't stress this enough. For my needs and my usual workstation tests where we try and do a full CPU cycle render in Serif Movie Plus X6, which is brutal software to run even on these modern processors, it's just not enough to stress it out because it deals with 4K footage there with no problems. We have had to invent an AI benchmark and Gord bot running Google Gemini to actually try and put some load on things. And I would imagine in a home lab scenario, this would be a phenomenal bit of kit, because you could get away with hosting servers on it, playing a few games on it, audio workloads with OpenVINO, video editing, and LLM hosting, which is absolutely insane. It goes without saying they've of course got great build quality, it's GEEKOM, you get a 3-year warranty, you get after sales support, kinda makes sense with these guys. I've been dealing with them for a little while now and viewers of the channel will know that, to be fair, they're pretty good to deal with. I'm pretty much allowed to test what I want, so I made this, I just had to make tests that were actually more brutal for this. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed watching. I'm sure they'll send me some links to whack in the description in case you're interested. And if you are someone that's looking at getting into a home lab on a mini PC, that's where I really think this is certainly probably the best I've come across. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. Thank you to GEEKOM for allowing us to actually take a look at this, because LLM hosting, we now have a benchmark for it. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and good night.